It's Friday, the 14th of July, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by our correspondent Rhodri Lewis in Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, the House of Lords inflicts a series of defeats to the government's illegal migration bill.
We're a welcoming country, and whilst I accept your bill is needed to deter, it is time we show some compassion.
But the government accuses peers of trying to kill off the bill altogether.
Some of the changes made by the other place are, however, little short of wrecking amendments.
Senior Tories hit back after allies of Boris Johnson are accused of trying to undermine the Partygate inquiry.
Why is the committee trying to limit the speech of members of this House? Why were we, the named MPs, not given the opportunity to defend ourselves before the publication of this report?
Anger in the Senate after it's confirmed that free school meals won't be extended into the summer holidays.
Government is about priorities. I do not understand why £4 million can be found for a zip wire run by a private company in my constituency, rather than feeding children in families in need.
And Thames Water bosses resist calls for nationalisation after the company faces criticism over sewage spills and its finances.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here and potentially putting them in this position?
No, I won't apologise for my role as Chief
apologise.
Executive as Ofwat, no.
Okay.
Let's start here in Westminster with our correspondent Sean. It's been a week dominated by the government's proposed reforms to the asylum system, and it's fair to say those plans are being frustrated in the House of Lords. We've entered into ping-pong. What can you tell us?
So we're talking about the illegal migration bill, which is designed to deliver on the Prime Minister's promise to stop people crossing the Channel in small boats. And, of course, it contains within it this proposal that asylum seekers would be sent to Rwanda or some other third country to have their claims processed. So at the start of this week, we got to the final stage of the bill's process through the Lords. So this was what's called the third reading debate. It's a short debate. By the time we'd got there, though, as you said, the government had suffered a lot of defeats. Peers had made about 20 changes, in effect rewriting large parts of the bill. They arrived for this final debate waiting to hear whether the government was going to offer any concessions before it returned to the Commons, when we expected those defeats to be reversed. So we were waiting to see if there were concessions. What peers got at the start of the week were hints rather than any firm promises.
These children are especially at risk, coming to a strange country, not understanding the language, being easily picked up in cars and taken off, never to be seen again. Would the Minister be willing to explore the possibility of introducing stronger safeguards so that we can be reassured that fewer of these children will be lost in the future?
Well, I can reassure the noble lord that we take the welfare of these vulnerable children extremely seriously. We have had no alternative but temporarily to use hotels to give children in this situation an immediate roof over their heads whilst a local authority accommodation is found.
Has just said that the government takes the welfare of unaccompanied children seriously. How does that relate to the arrival centre in Dover, which had cartoons and welcoming signs for children, and which were ordered to be removed by the Home Office Minister because it might make the children feel too welcome? Isn't that a disgrace? And isn't it time that government backbenchers felt as embarrassed as we are that this is happening in our country?
The murals that the noble lord refers to were provided by our detention contractors and were not commissioned or approved by the Home Office. It's clearly the correct decision that these facilities have the requisite decoration befitting their purpose.
My lords.
I'm quite frankly ashamed at your last answer, Minister. I think people in this House and the wider community would have preferred your answer to have been it was a mistake to paint over those murals and that a contractor would be commissioned to repaint them. We're a welcoming country, and whilst I accept your bill is needed to deter, it is time we show some compassion, particularly.
If we are to stop the boats, it is imperative that the scheme as provided for in this bill is robust and sends the unambiguous message that if you enter the UK illegally, you will not be able to build a life here. Instead, you will be detained and swiftly returned, either to your home country or a safe third country. As a result of the many non-government amendments agreed by your Lordship's House at report stage, that message is no longer unambiguous. It is at best half-hearted and at worst now wholly absent from the bill. The government is reflecting carefully on each and every amendment, but I have no doubt that many will not find favour with the other place, and we will soon be debating them again.
The government set about doing something which is neither possible nor legal. We were told that, that the bill would stop the boats as a deterrent, but we know that the boats have been fuller than ever in the month of June.
This bill, unamended, is all pain and no gain, potentially creating a permanent underclass of tens of thousands of people who cannot be removed and whose claims for asylum will not even be examined, let alone accepted.
We will not be intimidated, pushed to actually back off from passing amendments that we think are important, from actually saying where we think the government has got it wrong. And that is immensely irritating. I've been in government. It is hugely irritating to a government to have that happen. But sometimes it actually works in that better legislation is passed.
Noble Lords are entirely right that I and the Department should think deeply about the amendments that have been proposed, and we will do that. It's clear that there will be some changes.
A lot of heated debate there for the Lords, particularly on this issue. After that, MPs, of course, had an opportunity to look at all the changes made by the Peers, 20 or so amendments, as you say. How did they react, the government, to all the Lords' amendments?
So when the bill came back to the Commons, that's when we did hear about these concessions, and the government offered 5 concessions. Changes to the time limit on when unaccompanied children and pregnant women can be detained, a promise to when the bill would actually start. The original plan was that once this bill became law, then the provisions would be retrospectively applied. So it would be as though the law had changed back in March. The government said, no, we'll wait now until the bill comes, and a few other changes around that. But at the heart of it was this rejection of what the Lords had done. And so we had quite a long debate where MPs went through all of these changes, and then we had several hours of voting at the end of the debate when basically the government got its way, although there were some hints of potential Conservative unhappiness over some of the proposals, as we'll hear. Now, I have to give you a spoiler alert that even after this debate, the bill went back to the Lords, and the Lords sat until the early hours of Thursday morning and inflicted more defeats on the government, which means that we're going to be going through all of this again next week. And the big question will be, will it be done in time? Because the government would like it to be done before the end of next week. And also, will the Home Office offer any more concessions? At the moment, they are saying no. And the concessions that they were offered earlier in the week in the Commons is it. We're going to have to see. Anyway, Robert Jenrick was the Minister at the dispatch box this time round.
The bill, as passed by this House, made it unambiguously clear to illegal migrants and people smugglers alike that if you come to this country by unlawful means, you won't be able to stay. Instead, you'll be detained and swiftly removed, either to your home country or to a safe third country. I'm grateful to the House of Lords for undertaking its proper role as a revising chamber. Some of the changes made by the other place are, however, little short of wrecking amendments. In considering each and every one of these amendments, we have to ensure that we don't drive a coach and horses through the core deterrent effect that we're trying to achieve here. And why do we want that deterrent effect? Because we don't want to see anyone, whether that be an adult or a child, crossing the channel in small boats, placing themselves in danger, placing themselves under the support and control of people smugglers and human traffickers.
Is it true that he gave orders to the Asylum Reception Centre to paint over children's cartoons? And if so, why? Because nobody believes that Mickey Mouse cartoons either encourage or deter boats to arrive, and they simply think that this is the minister actually not showing some common decency towards vulnerable children.
We didn't think that the setup in that particular unit was age appropriate because the majority of those individuals who were unaccompanied passing through it last year were teenagers. That does not change the fundamentals that we support anyone who comes to this country with decency and compassion.
The truth is that this bill is just a tawdry and deeply counterproductive attempt to show the government's doing something, anything, to respond to a growing asylum crisis of their making. The benches opposite know the asylum system is broken. Indeed, they admit to it, and they should know because they broke it. And their attempts to fix it are a shambles.
The evidence of the police is clear. If you want victims to provide evidence to bring slave drivers to justice, the victims need time, they need support, and they need to be here. This bill ties the hands of the police and it undoes the good work of the Modern Slavery Act. Now, I know that ministers have said this bill will enable more perpetrators to be stopped, but on modern slavery I genuinely believe it will do the opposite. It will enable more slave drivers to operate and make money out of human misery. It will consign more people to slavery.
The position of my party is that this remains an absolutely rotten and utterly misconceived and indeed a cruel bill that's not going to stop boats, but it's going to cause immense human suffering to people who have fled persecution and harm. And it is, for the reasons we've just heard, a trafficker's charter. And it's a bill that has been rushed through Parliament in a most appalling way without consultation and without proper scrutiny.
The ultimate tragedy of this bill is that it completely ignores the overriding problem. It will not fix the symptoms that it does identify, and it won't even give the government the political benefit that they crave, which is the one thing in this debate that constitutes justice.
On a different subject in Parliament, Sean, MPs had an opportunity to debate the Privileges Committee report, which accused 10 Conservative politicians, allies of Boris Johnson, of mounting attacks on the committee's inquiry into the former Prime Minister. What was the mood like in the chamber?
Well, it was less heated than it had been just a little while ago when they first debated this Partygate report, and of course that ended up with them approving the report, which had said that Boris Johnson had lied to Parliament. So this was really the follow-on. It was an opportunity, as a couple of MPs said, to close the chapter on this incident. So although it was less heated, it was also a moment when those MPs who'd been criticised in the report could actually put their case. Now, these MPs have been criticised and they've been accused in this report of a coordinated campaign to undermine the committee, and these were the MPs who perhaps had said that they thought it was unfair, and the phrase kangaroo court was bandied about a bit. So it was also a debate that, because of decisions the Speaker took not to accept amendments, meant that at the end of the debate there weren't going to be any sanctions for these MPs. They weren't going to be punished. So they were just going to be criticised in public rather than punished. So it was a different feel, as we'll hear.
I hope colleagues who have been named will reflect on their actions. One of the most painful aspects of this whole affair is that it has involved animosities between colleagues and colleagues of the same political hue. But I know of at least one member named in the report who has taken the time to speak with regret to some other members of that committee, and I applaud them for doing so. I hope that some speeches we might hear this afternoon will acknowledge that obligation we have to one another as colleagues. If Castlereagh and Canning could adopt polite civility after fighting a duel, I live in hope that today will be the end of this sorry affair.
Now, Mr. Speaker, in my view, the named MPs should apologise. Unfortunately, instead, some of them so far have doubled down, claiming that what they've said is merely them exercising their right to freedom of speech. That is absolute nonsense, Mr. Speaker. They tried to interfere in a disciplinary procedure that was voted for unanimously by this House. Nobody voted against it. If those members had wanted to, as the report sets out, there were other legitimate ways open to them as MPs who want to influence any Privileges Committee inquiry.
Boris Johnson was shown to have lied to the House and to the Privileges Committee, yet some of his most ardent supporters sought to interfere, undermine and attack the integrity of the committee and its work.
There are some issues with this report, I think beginning, as it happens, with its title, Coordinated Campaign of Interference. There is no evidence that it was coordinated, and I can speak on my own account, and I think I may get support from the whip on duty and indeed from the 10 Downing Street press office if it were able to comment. I'm not very often coordinated with the official line to take. Indeed, I've always thought that it is politically rather important that members should be independent in what they say and in how they vote.
The Parliamentary Security Department felt it necessary to carry out an urgent review of the personal safety, constituency offices, constituency events and homes of the members of the Privileges Committee.
There are definitely issues that members of this House, many members of this House, have faced with security. I do not believe that criticising the actions of a committee has that effect, and if the honourable gentleman really takes that route, then we have to agree with each other the whole time. And admirable, though I thought the Leader of the House's request was that we should get on better, that I'm afraid was knocked for 6 by the Shadow Leader of the House in her rather cantankerous comments that followed.
It's not acceptable for members fearing an outcome which they don't want to level criticisms at the committee so that in the event that the conclusion is the one that they don't want, they will have undermined the inquiry's outcome by undermining confidence in the committee.
Members who try to blacken the name of those who are doing reports and unleash that kind of process against them, I would suspect knew exactly what they were doing, knew exactly the kind of pressure they were trying to bring to bear. And it's shameful, absolutely shameful, that some of the members who were named in this report indulged in this kind of behaviour. 2 ex-cabinet ministers, members of the Privy Council, an ex-leader of this House who knows better, and he knows better.
Why is the committee trying to limit the speech of members of this House? Why were we, the named MPs, not given the opportunity to defend ourselves before the publication of this report? I believe that the answers to these questions point to the fact that the committee has overstepped the remit given to them by this place.
I do want to say, on behalf of the Mother of the House, just to contextualise her appointment, the member for Camberwell and Peckham had already announced her intention to retire from Parliament at the next election, a parliamentary career that has spanned 5 decades and has been defined, probably more than any other person who's ever sat in this House, by her commitment to the advancement of women's rights. 14 weeks after she took up, 14 weeks before she took up that appointment, her husband of 40 years, Jack, had died. Against this background, I invite members of the House to consider what is more likely, that she agreed to chair the committee as a final act of service to this House, or that she did so because she was interested in pursuing a personal vendetta against Boris Johnson.
There was an emotional exchange there between Laura Farris on the Conservative side and Harriet Harman. But finally, Sean, it was another battle of the deputies at Prime Minister's Questions, second week in a row, because Rishi Sunak was at the NATO summit and Keir Starmer was there too. What did the deputy leaders focus on in their absence?
So, yes, as you say, second week running for Oliver Dowden and Angela Rayner. And the focus of their exchanges was on the cost of living And in particular, there were some concerns from Labour about some new figures on child poverty, but also a familiar theme over the past few weeks, mortgage rate rises and the problems people are having with their bills. And Angela Rayner perhaps felt the hand of history on her shoulder, to coin a phrase.
I looked up the last time a Prime Minister missed 2 sessions in a row with other engagements, which was March 1996. And I'm very proud to be filling the boots of Lord John Prescott. But I think it's safe to say he's no Heseltine, Mr. Speaker. Why is it, John Prescott asked, that in Tory Britain, tens of thousands of families are facing repossession, negative equity and homelessness? And can he tell us, 27 years later, why I'm having to ask the same question?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, clearly the Right Honourable Lady did not listen to my previous comments. The Prime Minister is at NATO. Of course, that wouldn't be a problem if she'd had her way. Her old boss wanted to abandon Ukraine, abolish the army and withdraw from NATO, and he certainly wouldn't be going to any summit, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to house building, I will take no lectures from the party opposite on home ownership. My parents would not have been able to buy their own home if it were not for Margaret Thatcher and the reforms introduced by her government, and this government is building on those with record house building.
Mr. Speaker, I think he's taken lessons from the former Prime Minister on telling the facts. The last Labour government worked hard to dramatically reduce the number of children in temporary accommodation. But under the Tories, the number of homeless children has risen by 75%. I'm proud of our record on tackling child poverty. Does the Right Honourable Gentleman feel ashamed of his?
Deputy Prime Minister. I'll tell you what this government has done. We've lifted 400,000 children out of child poverty. We have introduced the national living wage, something the party opposite totally failed to do, and increased the national living wage by the largest amount ever, meaning £1,800 for working people, and cutting their taxes by doubling the personal allowance. That is the surest way to ensure we lift people out of poverty, and would never have happened with the party opposite.
What matters is what people feel every single day at the moment, who are going to work and can't afford their mortgage, can't afford their rent and can't afford their bills because of this Conservative government. There are 55,000 more children without a permanent address today compared to when they took office 13 years ago. We've gone from a Labour cabinet focused on tackling child poverty to Tory ministers who won't even admit the problem. Just like the question time in March 1996, they can only offer excuses and not answers. Lord John Prescott said to Lord Michael Heseltine that day, "How can the Right Honourable Gentleman be so complacent in the face of sheer misery created by his government's policies?" 27 years on, why are we asking the exact same thing?
I know there's a reshuffle coming up on the other side, but this audition for John Prescott's old job is just getting a little bit hackneyed. It is this government that has lifted 400,000 children out of poverty. The party opposite, I hear the Right Honourable Lady claiming to be the party of working people, but under their policies, people can't even get to work. They support Just Stop Oil protesters blocking our roads. They support their union paymasters stopping our trains. And, of course, they support the hated ULEZ stopping cars across our capital. While Conservatives get Britain moving, Labour are standing in everyone's way.
Oliver Dowden there. And, of course, next week we'll have another round, the final round of Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, perhaps. Thanks, Sean. We'll be back with you in a moment. Let's go to Cardiff and our Wales political correspondent, Rodri Lewis, who's at the Senedd. Hello to you, Rodri. In the final round of First Minister's questions before the summer break, Mark Drakeford had to defend one of his ministers from accusations he wasn't up to the job. And some Labour figures weren't very impressed by a decision to axe free school meals during the summer holidays. What was the story with the minister?
Last week, the Economy Minister, Vaughan Gething, gave evidence of the UK COVID inquiry, as he was, of course, Health Minister here in Wales during the time of the pandemic. And during the hearing, Mr Gething said he hadn't read a number of documents looking at things like civil emergencies and pandemic flu and so on. And he said he'd only read them much more recently when he was getting ready to give evidence to the inquiry. Now, the opposition parties here took issue with that, and the matter was raised by the Conservative leader, Andrew R.T. Davis.
Why would a minister who's responsible for the health portfolio not read his papers and make sure that he was making the best informed decisions to make sure that Wales was protected and have the best measures in place should we be hit by a pandemic?
All ministers, when they become responsible for a new portfolio, receive an enormous amount of information from their civil servants. It summarises a huge amount of what they will need to know. It indicates to them where they will need to do further and more in-depth reading, and ministers follow that advice. Any suggestion that a minister could embark upon a back catalogue of documents produced over a period of 15 years and at the same time discharge their everyday responsibilities, it simply does not reflect the way in which government is conducted in Wales or in any other part of the United Kingdom.
Now, Vaughan Gething also told the inquiry that some of the documents were not for ministers to read, and that if he had done so, he wouldn't have had time to do anything else.
Plaid Cymru wanted to talk about something different, which was employment, or unemployment, I should say.
Yes, that's right. The jobless figures were on the mind of the leader of Plaid Cymru, Rhun ap Iorwerth, who said he was also worried about the state of Welsh business in general. He asked about the Zimmer Biomet company. Now, 2 weeks ago, it said it wanted to close its plant in Bridgend, putting 540 jobs at risk. Now, Rhun ap Iorwerth asked why ministers hadn't seen that coming.
Wales has the highest unemployment rate in the UK, the highest in 5 years, rising for a third month running. But again, with Zimmer Biomet, we've seen what appears to be a lack of engagement by Welsh Government to look out for those warning signs. We need those warning mechanisms, and it raises questions too about the tracking of public funds given to businesses. Zimmer Biomet received £700,000 of taxpayers' money in 2016.
It's just plain nonsense. The company made its decision to announce its intentions without a single word to the Welsh Government, to its own employees, to the UK Government. There's no finger on any pulse that is going to detect an announcement that the company is determined to make on its own terms and without informing anybody else. And to suggest that somehow there was intelligence there to be collected, only someone was alert to it, it simply does not reflect at all what happened in this case.
Now, Mark Drakeford says his officials were talking to businesses all the time about any problems they may be having, but he said companies always have the final say on whether or not to close a factory.
And, Rodri, there was a row over free school meals for children.
Yes, that's right. Wales began funding free school meals, not just in school during term time, but also in the holidays as well for eligible families back during the pandemic. Now, that had been extended until May this year, but this week Mark Drakeford said it wouldn't be carrying on during the forthcoming school summer holidays. Now, as you'd expect, the opposition wasn't happy, and some Labour backbenchers weren't impressed either.
What evaluation has been done, therefore, on the impact of these decisions on child poverty? Why weren't families and third sector organisations given more notice? Doesn't this decision run counter to the ambitions and priorities set out in the draft child poverty strategy? And what is your response to Save the Children Cymru, who say all this is a huge step back in tackling child poverty and food insecurity?
Government is about priorities. I do not understand why £4 million can be found for a zipwire run by a private company in my constituency, rather than feeding children in families in need. It is very late for the government to change course now. Can I urge the government to ask local authorities to fund free meals this summer from their reserves and pay for them for it in next year's budget? Feeding children who are poor has to be a priority for a Labour government.
Well, Mike Hedges will know that I share his priority, and he will also know that we made an announcement in March which indicated that the extension was until the end of May. He will also know that the government's budget is worth almost £1 billion less. And as a consequence of that, it is impossible for any government to proceed with no impact on people's lives. We are not talking about impact on a list of things which we might all be able to say are nice to have. We are talking about the impact of that on programmes that are very important to lots of people.
Now, as you saw there, Jeremy Miles said all this was happening as Wales had less money to spare because he said the Westminster government wasn't managing the economy responsibly or funding public services adequately either.
Rodri Lewis, the Senate there. Thank you very much. Let's return to Westminster and our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. Thames Water bosses came in for something of a rough ride, unsurprisingly, being questioned by a committee of MPs after speculation the company actually might go bust. What did MPs want to know?
Yes, well, this was a bit of a blockbuster committee hearing, really. Thames Water, Britain's biggest water company, has been in the headlines an awful lot recently. Just a couple of weeks ago, the chief executive left. As you say, there's been a lot of speculation about its finances and whether the government may have to step in at some point. And of course, there have been those complaints about customer service. And of course, the big issue that's come up this year a lot, the whole business about sewage in rivers and coastlines and waterways. So this committee was hearing not just from Thames Water, but also from the regulator, Ofwat, and from the Water Minister, Rebecca Powell. So they had everybody in the same room, all the people that they wanted to shout at, really. And they did. They gave the witnesses a very hard time and they were looking for some apologies.
Perhaps if I could start off by asking Mr Cochrane, I suppose. Have you been at Thames the longest of the three witnesses, would you say? You have. So maybe I can ask by so where did it go so horribly wrong?
So I was brought in with a whole new executive team to turn around this business. This business matters. It serves 15 million customers.
It went wrong before you arrived and you were trying to fix things.
Our job is collectively to turn this business around. We have very patient shareholders and they have been incredibly supportive of this business. They have already provided £500 million of equity this year in March, which was fully drawn by the company. They have offered what is the largest equity support package to the UK water industry since privatisation, in the form of £750 million for in the next 2 years. And they've indicated that a further £2.5 billion of equity would be required to turn this business around.
Do you understand why the public would like to see our government or whoever being responsible for the water company so that everything's transparent? It's not as though we can shop around as customers. It's a vital utility. We don't know who all these investors are from foreign companies that own our utilities. Can you understand, any of you or all of you, why the public want transparency?
I can understand the frustration of customers. We want to see improvements. We would love to be able to deliver all those improvements overnight, but it will take time. We will try very hard to bring the customers with us. And we've got to improve our standing with customers. We're absolutely agreed on that. But I think the way is continuing the private sector model not reverting to the public sector. That would be my instinct.
Okay, I mean, on the ground in Whitstable, in my constituency, there's lots of poo and sewage, so it'd be nice to improve that.
We're here today because Thames Water, which you now run, is in a position where the government is having to plan to renationalise you because of a failure of your finances. The reason we're in this position, and the reason that taxpayers are now potentially on the hook for billions and billions of pounds of national borrowing, is because you, as the chief executive of the regulator, and the regulator failed in delivering your statutory duties. Do you want to apologise to the public, Ms Ross?
Everybody at Ofwat takes their statutory duties incredibly seriously.
What, did you perform them?
We were exercising our functions in pursuit of our statutory duties. Whether every decision we made was perfect with the benefit of hindsight, possibly not, but that's exactly what we were trying to do.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here and potentially putting them in this position where, yet again, another regulated market could potentially collapse and expose taxpayers to billions of pounds?
I think if you're asking for an apology from Ofwat, I think you should...
Asking for an apology from you, Ms Ross?
No, I won't apologise for my role as the chief
apologise.
executive as Ofwat, no.
Okay.
If it was a worst-case scenario, how advanced are plans to potentially nationalise Thames Water, and have you estimated any costs of doing that?
Well, I'll reiterate, we're nowhere near that, and what we don't want to do is scare people. This is being closely monitored by Thames. They're working incredibly closely with Ofwat to steer through this.
Feisty session there with the MPs. There was also another committee session this week, Sean, focusing on the gambling industry's reaction to the government's recent white paper, looking into possible reforms. What happened during that evidence session?
Yes, so this was the Culture Committee, and they were hearing, as you say, from representatives of the gambling industry. And the MPs were concerned about some of the issues that we've heard a lot over the last few months, the issue of what can be done to help people who've got gambling addictions, who are problem gamblers, as they're often described. Also, this very controversial issue that's been raised a lot in the Commons about sports advertising and gambling advertising and what effect that might have. And they did get some pushback there, where they were told, well, there isn't really very much evidence to suggest a link between sports advertising and gambling. But they certainly did give the representatives of the industry quite a grilling.
Problem gambling, that includes a whole cohort of different kinds of people and issues and behaviours. It also does include, in extreme cases, those suffering from what the NHS call disordered gambling, recognised psychiatric condition. And for those people and their families, the consequences can be absolutely devastating.
We've developed 11 codes over the last 3 years, doing over 80 substantial measures which sit on top of regulation and legislation in order to create that safer gambling culture. What is also noticeable is that the reduction in problem gambling rates that have occurred over the last 7 years, they have nearly halved since 2017. To today, we have a 0.3%, one of the lowest problem gambling rates internationally.
A complete ban on advertising in sports grounds might be a sensible thing to do, because at the moment, something when we were young you never saw, which is footballers running around like athletic billboards for companies with emblazoned over their fronts at companies. That's going to make it attractive for children.
If the objective is to reduce harm, to tackle problem gambling, it would be a sensible thing to do to ban sports sponsorship, ban football advertising, all advertising grounds, the things that you've suggested. It would be a sensible thing to do if there was any evidence that there was a link between advertising and sports sponsorship and problem gambling. And the government, having reviewed all of the evidence, found no evidence and made that very clearly.
The English Premier folk did not, because they're voluntarily removing ads from the shirts in 2025, 2026. Well, that's an admission that it does do harm. They wouldn't agree to do it if they hadn't concluded that it did harm. So the English Premier, thinks that it does harm. So if they've concluded it does harm, it makes sense to go a little stage further and remove all advertising from shirt sleeves, for example, and round pitches.
The Premier League didn't actually, I'm afraid, conclude that there was harm. They recognised that there was public concern about the scale and volume of branding around football, and they responded to that.
Is there anything more effective you think we can do
to prevent people being attracted to into the black market as a result of any regulations that may come as a result of legislation.
Wes talked before about some of the declining numbers on rates of problem gambling, and that's obviously really welcome news. If I can be candid with the committee, part of me worries that perhaps part of that decline in problem gambling is that some of these people have just fallen off our books. You know, that as we've put restrictions in place, closed VIP schemes, raised standards, all of the rest of it, absolutely the right thing to do in raising standards, that I think there has been a displacement, which would explain why you've had roughly a doubling of the number of customers and a doubling of the amount being staked.
Finally, Sean, there was a rather unusual debate in Parliament calling for Swift bricks to become mandatory for new housing. What's behind the idea?
Yes, so various groups and charities have estimated that the Swift population has declined over the last 25 years by perhaps as much as 60%. And these new bricks include a cavity that would allow the birds to nest. And thousands of people signed a petition calling for these new Swift bricks to be compulsory whenever a new house is built. So they want it to be something that you have to put in whenever there is a new house. And because enough people signed the petition, MPs held a debate on it.
It's a fairly simple ask around how we put measures in place to provide for endangered species in new build housing. But it's an incredibly urgent debate, as these birds are quite frankly running out of time. Swifts, house martins, starlings and house sparrows recently joined the international red list of species experiencing a sharp decline in population, and it's essential we take action to prevent their extinction. In the UK, the swift population has declined by 57%. Swift bricks are one measure which could help turn the corner for all four of these species. The bricks sit inside of the wall and do not compromise the strength of the wall nor the insulation, being fully enclosed with a small outward-facing hole for the swifts to enter through.
I celebrate swifts every day throughout the summer because they are absolutely my favourite bird. They truly are one of nature's miracles. They spend most of their lives flying, and after leaving the nest, they don't land again, sometimes for an astonishing 3 years. Indeed, they can do everything on the wing, feeding on insects and airborne spiders, skimming mouthfuls of water to drink when flying over smooth rivers or lakes, and bathing by flying slowly through falling rain. They can even sleep in flight. Their numbers are declining at a terrifying rate, with a staggering 62% fall between 1995 and 2021.
Our instinct when it comes to achieving biodiversity net gain, including the specific 10% BNG target in all new developments that will apply from November this year, is to allow for maximum local discretion, because it is local communities and their representatives who are best placed to determine what specific measures are appropriate on any given development site. As such, we certainly have a degree of sympathy with the government's position that local authorities and developers should not be compelled to include swift bricks in every single housing unit.
We know that this is urgent. We know that there can do no harm to have a swift brick, even if a swift doesn't use it. We know that starlings might, or we know that sparrows might. So I really don't understand where his reluctance is coming from on this point.
We do also believe that we do need to be cautious when it comes to mandating national planning conditions. There could be some circumstances where development proposals, for example, will not impact on bird habitats.
The worst case scenario, if you put one up and it doesn't get used, is nothing. There's no problem. You could probably have other birds that will use it. So can I please impress upon the Minister that warm words don't get us anywhere. I'm hearing too many warm words and not enough action. This is a simple thing she could do, and I cannot believe that she's refusing to do it.
Impassioned plea there from the Green MP, Caroline Lucas. Thank you very much, Sean. That's all we have time for. And in fact, this is the last Politics UK for this term. It will, of course, return in September. And I'll be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.